Over the last 6 months, the conflict has quietly split the market into two. Some developers, some properties, and some areas got hit hard, and most owners holding those properties don't even realize it yet. And on the other side, some properties and some developers will continue to thrive. So today we're getting into which properties are going to actually survive this market and which properties are going to get affected the most. We'll cover everything from different areas, different developers, and different properties so that you can have a full picture on what's actually going on in the market. Joining me today is Matt Lowe, one of the best real estate agents that I personally know. I've met very few people who have as much knowledge as him when it comes to Dubai's property market, which is why he's the perfect guest for today. So Matt, a good place to start would be, how has the conflict affected Dubai's real estate market over the last 6 months?
Okay, so when we look at the conflict and the data that we have available to us to suggest what's happened to the real estate market, we can look at the transaction volumes and we can look at rental transaction volumes. So when we look at the amount of uncertainty within the region, naturally there's going to be a slowdown in the market. People are just holding back. They don't want to invest. Sellers were very hesitant on selling their property as well. People were just waiting to get a better idea as to what's happening in the market, which is natural. Now, when you look at transaction data, you have to understand that it can take a while for transactions to actually appear in the data. So for a property that's signed in January, it can transfer in March, April time if it's mortgaged, and obviously cash is a lot quicker. So from the effect that we've seen with the conflict starting in February, March, we actually seen the biggest drop in transactions happen in May, and that was a 55% drop. So there was a slowdown in the market, but you have to remember that that's going to be account for mortgage transactions that were happening before the conflict, that may account for cash transactions that had happened after the conflict, but you can still see and get an idea as to how much the market had slowed down, and it was suggesting around a 55% slowdown in the month of May. So that gives us an idea of that. Then when you look at rental transactions, obviously that shows up quicker in the data. You can see what's happening in the market quicker. The biggest drop off was in March. I don't know if you know the number for the amount of
30% from February.
So a 30% drop was more instant, and you could see that obviously a lot clearer.
Because rental transactions, they show up instantly into the system. They don't have the 2-month lag like sales transactions.
So that gives us a clearer picture on how the market slowed down. That's been a massive effect on the market. And even still, we're not going to sugarcoat things. Things are still a bit slower in the market right now. Well, not a bit. They're quite a lot slower in the market right now than it was pre this sort of global tension that we're seeing at the moment.
I have the numbers on June. So when it comes to sales transactions, we can see a 30% increase from May to June when it comes to sales transactions. And when it comes to rental transactions, this is where it gets a bit interesting. So we actually see an 80% increase from March. And the number of transactions in June is around 18,000. And in February, it's around 16,000. So it's actually higher than pre-conflict. Now, a lot of people will say that Dubai's market is back to all-time highs, but in reality, that's not really the case. Most probably what's happening is all of the people who delayed their move in March and in May, that backlog of tenants is potentially now showing up in June, which is why there's a spike in data. But it's still good to see that the overall sentiment in the market is slowly starting to improve.
Yeah, the sentiment's definitely improving. Obviously, I'm getting a lot more inquiries from new people looking to capitalize on opportunities. But something else that people are worried about is obviously prices. What's happening to the prices for sellers? They're worried about, potentially what's happening to their market value of their property. Or for new people coming into the market, a big thing is, can they capitalize on a deal right now? So what's actually happening to the prices at the moment? What's been the effect of the conflict on the market from what you've seen?
So when it comes to property prices, it's a lot more complicated than, for example, just looking at the transaction data. Because if you look at the overall market, in the last 6 months, overall property prices have only went down by maximum around 5%, which doesn't really reflect the true data. Because you'll have some areas where the prices went a lot lower and some areas where the property prices didn't even change. So what's important in Dubai's real estate market is to understand that there's one big market, but you need to identify all of the different markets and understand which markets have been affected the most and which ones are continuing to be resilient. So I'll give you a few examples of different markets. Let's look at apartments in touristic locations like the Marina. When the conflict first kicked off, tourism slowed down massively, obviously. So you had a lot of investors there who had their units on the short-term rental market that are now considering alternative routes because the short-term rental route will yield them lower returns. So when you have all of these investors listing their property, that creates a rush of supply into this location, which can affect property prices, and we did see that in the Marina. But when you look at, for example, certain villa communities like Arabian Ranches, you will see that the prices have not changed at all, and the reason for this is very simple. These mature villa communities are mostly end-user driven or owner-occupied. So just because the property price went down by 10%, a family wouldn't leave their home that they've been living in their entire life. That's why the villa market is a lot more resilient. Now, that's not to say that apartments, for example, are bad or only villas are good, because we've seen that in locations where the supply is a lot more controlled, for example, like Expo City, where the supply is a lot more controlled, property prices have barely moved there over well.
Yeah, Expo is a good example of something that people overlook, I think. This is because people look at a payment plan and locations where you're only putting in 40% and people are flipping a property, right? Expo, you're right about the supply being very constrained there, but also you're surrounded by a type of investor that has the ability to hold their unit. They don't need to sell. With the payment plan, you're either investing with Emaar on 80/20, or you're investing in with Expo, where you have post-handover payment plans or more flexibility to be able to have that cash flow within their products, right? So with somebody buying an 80/20 with Emaar, right, in Expo, they're not buying that to flip that, and they're knowing that they're putting 80% in during the whole construction period, right? They haven't got a 40/60 payment plan where they know they're going to flip 40% on handover, right? That controls the market and to an extent, right? Obviously, that doesn't go for the whole community. You'll find people in there that are speculating and maybe they do want to flip on handover, but the overall sentiment is a lot stronger, and that's something really important to look at. And then going back to what you were saying about end user demand as well, that's so important in a market like this, to have real end users that are going to live in a property. That's going to hold the market together so much stronger than a speculative location. Marina was a perfect example as well. So even apartments, you can find end user apartment locations as well, or apartment buildings more specifically, right? So where you find very high occupancy rates would be specific buildings within these micro markets. You could even narrow it down for specific micro markets, then go down to another level of having specific buildings that are highly demanded in that specific community. So there's levels to look at, and that's where it can be confusing for an investor.
For example, a building that has a very high occupancy in an area that has a lot of competition is somewhere like Dubai Hills, for example. If you look at an Ellington building, you'll barely find any listings available, because that solves a real gap in the market when it comes to Dubai Hills, which is high quality apartments but living inside of a community.
Yeah, products like that where you're end user driven is a perfect example of something that's going to be more resilient during a market like this. And going back to your point about micro markets reacting differently, within those micro markets, like I was saying, there's specific buildings that are going to react differently within that micro market as well. So it's quite complex, but you have to break it down, identify these opportunities, and that's how you can start to look at the real estate market.
One part of the market that unfortunately I see investors who invested into this type of product will unfortunately struggle is developments that were sold on a 20/80 payment plan. Obviously, there were a lot of agents selling the idea of this development that you only need 20% equity in and then you flip it on handover. Now, what does that do? It puts a lot of over-leveraged investors into one development that they all have the same goal. On handover, they want to flip, and most of them don't even plan on paying the handover payment. So when handover comes, a lot of them will be stressed, which will cause some investors to actually sell below their original price, and that's how you create a downward pressure war inside of your own building.
Yeah, and another thing on that as well is that with a 20/80 payment plan, it's about what people promise you when you're buying it to the investor, right? So a lot of people get promised that they can mortgage that 80% as well. Obviously, with the conflict, with this situation, people may not have as easy bank financing right now with their current jobs, or potentially even if they're an international investor, they only get a certain specific amount that they can leverage in a property. So that also causes a pressure as well that people don't think about. And that's the risk that you have to take with leveraging on a property.
Even for the developers, for example, because the developers need your funds to do the construction. If they're only taking in 20% throughout the entire construction period, but then it costs them 30 to 40% to actually develop the project, that means they're paying from their own pockets. And for a developer that's small and already running on small margins, and construction costs are now higher because of the recent conflict, that's a difficult situation for the developer, and that's not where you want to be placing your money. So you have over-leveraged investors and over-leveraged developers all into one development, which is not the best place to have your capital. Now, what about off-plan prices from developers, for example? If I bought with Emaar maybe like 7 months ago in a project, is Emaar now, for example, launching prices lower? What's the situation on that?
No, so what you'll find with the bigger developers, right, with Emaar, with your government-backed developers, Miras, Nakheel, Dubai Holding, you'll find that these guys, they set the whole tone for the market, right? If they're undercutting all of their previous investors that have invested into their projects, it's not going to land well with their investors, but also the general market. These guys are selling billions worth of real estate into the market. If they're undercutting and dropping the prices, that's going to have a knock-on effect overall in the market as well.
We even saw this with Amar in COVID. When sales did slow down, Amar still chose to protect its investors by not dropping in the prices. So what's the most realistic situation for the developer to do? Because obviously they still want to sell their projects.
So realistically, like I said, with bigger developers, you don't necessarily get price cuts. What you will find is potentially better payment plans. With your smaller developers, obviously these guys are more incentivized to sell. They need to sell their products to maintain a good financial position during this time. So you may find that they'll give you DLD waivers, better price points, discounts, payment plans. But again, you have to be careful when you're investing. No matter what the product is, you shouldn't be investing because of a payment plan or a DLD waiver. You should be investing because the product is right. And if you get anything on top of that and the price point, make sure the price point's right. But if you get anything on top of that, it's a bonus. You shouldn't be investing just because of the payment plan.
If a developer is offering you 20 to 30% off just because, for example, you're paying in cash, I would say that's not really the type of developer that you want to be investing with. Because the big developers, they'll never ever give you a discount that big because they know their product is good and they're still able to sell.
Okay, so give everyone a general idea on what you think is going to happen to the prices in the general market.
So overall, over the next maybe year or two, I do see there's a chance that the overall market will look like it's going on a downward trajectory. And there's a very simple reason for this. Over the last few years, there were a lot of off-plan apartments that were sold much higher than the ready market. So for example, if the ready market is here, the prices of these off-plan properties were much higher. So when handover comes, a lot of these investors that wanted to flip their property, now they realize they have to sell their property on the same price as the ready market, which could look like property prices are down because on paper it looks like a 15% discount, but in reality it's a lot of investors who overpaid for their property are now selling it for their real market value. And the majority of the supply in Dubai is overpriced apartments sold by small developers. That's around 80% of the supply. So the data would get skewed towards those transactions. And I mean, some stuff that was getting sold, like for example, you're looking at developers selling at 2,000 dirhams per square foot in Dubai land, which is not the nicest location. You think to yourself, who's actually buying that? And it's unfortunate because some agents are advising their clients to buy these types of properties, but these are the properties that are going to take a hit. Now, the opposite is also true. The property price is forced to increase just to match the ready market. And even if the ready market does go down over the next few years, they still have a big enough buffer zone for them to make profits. So you can't just look at the overall headline of the market. You need to understand what segments of the market are not going to perform and what segments of the market are investors going to continue to make profits.
Yeah, I think that's something that people overlook, right? Is their entry price, is it actually making sense considering the market price today? Because people forget that off-plan property is only determined what the real value is once that hands over and somebody pays a price in the ready market. The developer sets the price off plan, but the ready market determines the actual price of that property. And as an investor, you have to identify, does this price that I'm entering at make sense compared to the ready market? Because everything else is essentially irrelevant in that sense. What other developers are launching at, what off-plan resales are transacting at. The only thing that matters is the ready market and the transactions in the ready market. So when you're using a comparable for an off-plan property, you always have to benchmark it against what somebody's paid in the ready market. It could be an end user, it could be another investor, but whatever somebody's paid once the property has handed over, that's your benchmark, not off-plan.
And that's a problem. I think a lot of investors and agents got very comfortable over the last few years because you could buy any overpriced property and almost everyone made profits. But now it's not going to be the case. If you are going to buy an overpriced property, over the next few years, selling that property for a profit will be extremely hard. So if I had to just boil it down to what investors are going to succeed in this market and what investors that unfortunately won't get the best results, it's the investors who understand that their profit margins, if they are buying off-plan, is the ready market. How big is the buffer zone between your off-plan property and your ready market? And that's how you understand your potential for growth. But if you're just going to buy any overpriced off-plan apartment in the middle of nowhere, the chances of you making a profit on a property like that is very low.
Yeah, I think you just have to be more selective than ever right now when you're investing investing into the market, because there are some really good opportunities right now, but 90% of them don't make any sense. That's the reality of the market. And that has been the case pre-conflict. You know, this isn't something that's just magically appeared now during the conflict. There was already locations, properties that were at risk before any of this happened, you know. I've seen a lot of developers selling their stock overpriced. I've seen a lot of people buying into communities where there was a lot of supply coming up and they're going to face a lot of liquidity problems later on. You know, there's a lot of things that you have to consider before you invest. And all of these things haven't just occurred now that there's been a bit of uncertainty in the market. The fundamentals of Dubai are still the same. You know, the strength of the market is still there long term. Right now, you just have to be filtering out what makes sense given this current market condition. And that hasn't changed from what made sense before. You know, now is just a better time to make a better entry point into the market.
So what properties do you see still succeeding regardless of what happened with the conflict?
So it goes back to just following the right framework. We were talking about end user demand, right? That's a safety layer because it constrains the supply. You've got emotional end users that will pay you a premium. They're not looking at the rental income that it's generating. End user demand is extremely important. The location, you know, are you close to your demand drivers, downtown DIFC, Business Bay, potential upcoming ones, Expo City, Jebel Ali Free Zone, JLT. You know, these demand drivers are where people are employed. They want to live nearby. Positioning your investments around these demand drivers is so important. If you invest in 45 minutes into the desert, you know, have you got a real sustainable demand coming from a nearby location? The other thing is scarcity, right? It gets thrown around a lot in Dubai, you know, invest into a scarce product, but investing into a scarce product isn't just investing into a tower with 100 units, right? A tower with 100 units, if it can be easily replicated 10 times, that's easily 1,000 units. And you didn't know about that when you've purchased it because the other ones weren't built yet.
Give us an example of like some scarce properties.
So there's different types of scarcity, right? But the scarcity factor, why it's scarce, has to be highly desirable as well. For example, the obvious one, waterfront property, coastline property. It can't be replicated and it's desirable from an end user for a waterfront property.
What's the supply for waterfront properties in Dubai?
So you're looking at about 8%, right? But that current 8%, you're not going to have that figure growing and growing because, you know, they can't keep replicating it. You know, it's scarce. And as developers keep going and building inland, you're going to see that number dropping as a percentage because more and more properties are coming up and the waterfront's staying limited.
Say, for example, like villas. Building a villa community takes a lot of capital. Not any developer can buy a large parcel of land and build on it horizontally because obviously it's a lot more profitable for a developer to build a building.
Another thing with villas as well is that there's a scarcity factor within villas. You know, you can look at golf course facing villas. It's very expensive for a developer to build a master community, but then to leave a massive portion of it for a golf course or, you know, for parks and amenities or open space, it's very expensive to not build on the land and leave it for amenities or open space for an end user.
That's why the overall supply for villas is only around like 7% because not any developer can build that massive.
Yeah, and then there's different levels of villa communities as well. So you'll find villa communities that are very compact, that are, you know, townhouses crammed into them or apartments, you know, and then there's different levels as to the desirability of living in these types of villa communities.
There's one segment of the market that most people aren't aware of, which has a massive scarcity element, but this kind of ties down with your bigger investors, and I would say commercial real estate, because you look at commercial real estate, the ready market is 10 times the size of the off-plan market in commercial real estate. You know, last 3 years you had around 1,100 transactions in the off-plan market for commercial real estate and around 10,000 transactions in the ready market. So, but for example, you look at residential, your off-plan is larger than the ready market. Now, it's not to say it's a bad thing about residential, but that just goes to show how good the scarcity factor is with commercial offices. That's why grade A offices have an occupancy level between 95 to 98% in grade A commercial zones.
Yeah, exactly. And these are the types of products, you know, going back to it, scarcity, location, highly demanded by end users. They'll stay resilient, but there's also some really good opportunity in these segments when you're identifying your entry price. Like you were saying, your entry price is below the ready market comparables. You can see the opportunity, right? And the fundamentals, if they're strong enough, that's the opportunities that you should be looking for in this market, not buying into the mass market where you're competing with lots of different people. And then obviously you can make the mistakes of buying above the ready market price. There's so many things that you have to really look at before you actually enter the market. And that's where you bridge the gap. You have an advisor that's going to give you that solid information and you have the education to make a proper decision on your investment.
And that's the key thing, obviously. It's just identifying the key opportunities because not all properties in Dubai are made equal.
So yeah, let me ask you a question for your channel, for your viewers. They're probably wanting to know, if you were an investor right now with cash, would you invest into the market right now?
So to answer the question, the first thing I ask someone is, do you believe in Dubai's vision over the next 5 to 10 years? If the answer is yes, and you do understand that the government is spending heavily to improve the city, capital is flowing in from all over the world, and Dubai has great potential over the next 10 years, now the question becomes, is right now the right time to be buying? Let's look at off-plan, for example, because that's our main investment vehicle. If we look at off-plan from developers, we know that big developers will not be dropping their prices. We've already seen this in COVID. Big developers will not drop their prices to hurt their previous investors. But now these same developers are offering incentives that they wouldn't have a couple of months back, like better payment plans. So now you need less capital actually invested by the time you reach handover. Now, even if you wanted to look at off-plan in the secondary market, so buying off-plan from an independent seller, if you look at the community, for example, that's priced a lot lower than the ready market, we understand that by the time this property reaches handover, it will appreciate to the ready market's level. But the reason you can still pick up a lot of these properties still on original price, even though they were sold a couple of months back, is because a lot of those communities, the handover and the construction has been delayed, so it wouldn't make sense for a future buyer to pay a premium on them. But we understand by the time it reaches handover, the property will appreciate to reach the ready market's price. So to answer your question, yes, I would be investing because I do believe in the government's vision over the next 10 years, and I do understand right now it's a buyer's market where developers and sellers are willing to offer incentives that they wouldn't have a couple of months back. So if you're looking to invest into Dubai's property market and you're looking for informed advice to make the right decision when actually investing into Dubai's market, my details will be down below in the description. We can have a conversation there and find the best suited property for your needs. Otherwise, I hope that you enjoyed the podcast, and make sure you subscribe for weekly videos.